The letter arrived at the wrong hands on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, carried by a mule that had seen better decades, and delivered to a man who had no business reading anyone else's mail, except that the preacher, Reverend Solomon Hatch of Caldwell, Kansas, had taken ill with a fever so fierce it could have boiled water, and his neighbor, Cornelius Watkins, had agreed to collect his correspondence from the post office on his behalf. Cornelius stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall, broad across the shoulders in the way that men who worked cattle and hauled timber tended to grow, with dark hair that curled a little at the temples when the summer heat rose, and sun-bronzed skin that had known more weather than comfort. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and he had a reputation in Caldwell for being the kind of man who showed up when things needed doing and disappeared before anyone could thank him for it. He was not mysterious about it. He simply did not care for gratitude. It made him uncomfortable in the way that fine clothing did, like something meant for another kind of person. He sorted through Reverend Hatch's mail on the front porch of the Reverend's modest clapboard house while the mule, Perseverance, chewed on a patch of dry grass near the fence post. Most of it was predictable. A bill from a printing house in Wichita, a notice about a regional council of ministers, a small package wrapped in brown paper that smelled faintly of dried lavender and which Cornelius set aside without investigating further. And then there was the letter. The envelope was made of paper that had once been cream-colored, but had been handled so many times on its journey that it had taken on the pale yellow of old bone. The handwriting on the front was careful and deliberate, the letters formed with the precision of someone who had learned to write in a schoolhouse but had spent years practicing in difficult circumstances. It was addressed to Reverend Solomon Hatch, shepherd of the flock, Caldwell, Kansas. In the top left corner, so small it nearly disappeared into the paper itself, was a return address: Nellie Wainwright, Dusk Creek, Kansas. Cornelius would have said it with the others. He would have carried the whole stack inside, arranged it on the Reverend's kitchen table, and gone home to his own duties without a second thought. But the envelope was not sealed properly. The gum had failed somewhere along the miles, and the letter had come partially loose, and one line of the writing inside was visible without any intention on his part to see it. He read it the way a man reads something he should not, all at once and without stopping. "Dear Reverend Hatch, I am writing to you because I do not know who else to turn to. My husband, Franklin Wainwright, passed from this earth 14 months ago after a snake bite turned to infection, and I have been working his claim alone since then with our 2 children, Thomas, who is 8, and Clara, who is 6. I am not writing to complain, as I know the Lord does not promise ease, only endurance. But I am writing because 3 weeks ago a man by the name of Harlan Creed came to my door with a paper he says proves Franklin owed him a debt, and that the land now belongs to him by right of that debt. And I do not know if the paper is lawful or if Mr. Creed is a dishonest man, but I am afraid, and I do not have the money for a lawyer, and I do not have a man to speak for me, and I am asking you, Reverend, if you know of any honest man in the territory who might look at this paper and tell me the truth of it, and if God is willing, help me understand what I might do. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for guidance. I will repay whatever kindness is shown to me by whatever honest means I have. Your faithful servant in Christ, Nellie Wainwright." Cornelius stood on Reverend Hatch's porch for a long time after he finished reading. He thought about the Reverend, who was indoors sweating through a fever and could not ride anywhere for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. He thought about Dusk Creek, which was 40 miles southwest, and which he had ridden through once on a cattle drive 3 years prior, and remembered as the kind of place that looked like it had been planted by people with hope and abandoned by everyone else. He thought about a woman with 8-year-old Thomas and 6-year-old Clara, working a dead man's claim alone, with somebody showing up at her door waving papers and wearing the specific kind of smile that men like Harlan Creed always wore. He did not know Harlan Creed personally, but he knew the type well enough to feel his jaw tighten. Cornelius went inside, checked on the Reverend, brought him a fresh pitcher of water and a bowl of broth that he heated on the stove himself, and told him that his mail had arrived and that one of the letters required a prompt response, and that he, Cornelius, intended to provide it. Reverend Hatch, glassy-eyed and half-conscious against his pillow, murmured something that Cornelius interpreted as permission and possibly also as a blessing, though it was hard to tell through the fever. He went home, saddled his horse, a deep-chested roan named December, and wrote a reply to Nellie Wainwright. He was not, by nature, a letter-writing man. He had rough hands and a direct manner and found most conversation to be more efficient when conducted face-to-face. But he wrote this letter with the same care he gave to any task that mattered, sitting at his kitchen table with the afternoon light slanting through the single window, choosing his words the way a man chooses footing when crossing uncertain ground. "Dear Mrs. Wainwright," he wrote, "my name is Cornelius Watkins. I am a neighbor of Reverend Hatch, who is currently unwell and asked me to attend to his correspondence. I have read your letter and I apologize for the intrusion. The envelope came open in transit. I am not a preacher, a lawyer, or a man of any particular standing. I am a rancher and a man who has spent enough years in Kansas to know something about land claims and the men who try to take them by questionable means. I will ride to Dust Creek on Friday if you are willing to receive me. I will look at the paper this man Creed brought you, and I will tell you honestly what I think of it. You asked for guidance and not charity, and I respect that, so I will not offer the latter, but I will offer what I can. If Friday does not suit, please send word to the Caldwell Post Office in care of Cornelius Watkins. Respectfully, Cornelius Watkins." He read it back. He almost added something more. He did not. He folded it, sealed it, and wrote it to the post office himself, paying the postage out of his own pocket. Then he spent the next 3 days not thinking about Nellie Wainwright any more than was strictly necessary, which was not very often at all, which was to say considerably. The ride to Dust Creek took him through country that was beautiful in the way that flat land under a wide sky is beautiful, not dramatically, not immediately, but with the kind of slow accumulation of detail that rewards patience. The prairie grass had turned that particular shade of green that it only held in spring before the summer heat bleached it toward gold. The sky was immense. Meadowlarks called from fence posts and clumps of wild plum shrub, and December moved beneath him with the long, easy stride of a horse that trusted its rider and had no objection to the road. Cornelius arrived in Dust Creek at mid-afternoon on a Friday, having set out before dawn. The town was smaller than he remembered, a mercantile, a livery stable, a saloon that looked like it had been built optimistically and had since revised its ambitions, a church with a listing steeple, and a handful of houses arranged without any particular plan along a main street that the wind had claimed as its own personal corridor. Beyond the town, the land spread out in parcels toward the horizon, and he stopped at the mercantile to ask directions to the Wainwright claim. The man behind the counter, wide, with a white apron and the cautious eyes of someone who had heard things he wished he hadn't, looked at Cornelius for a moment before answering. "You looking for Nellie Wainwright?" "I am. You know her. I'm here to help her with a matter." The man's expression shifted slightly. "Then I'll tell you where she is. She's a good woman. Harder worker than most men I know. Follow the main road east for about 2 miles, then turn south on the track with the broken wagon wheel hung on the post. Her place is another half-mile from there. Can't miss the windmill. Thank you. She's got children," the man added, as if this were additional information that required mentioning. "I know," Cornelius said. "I read her letter." He found the broken wagon wheel on its post and turned south and found the windmill and found the house, which was a low soddy with a wooden front face added on, the kind of construction that happened when a family had started with what the earth gave them and had gradually improved on it over years. There was a kitchen garden to one side, recently turned and planted, and a small barn behind the house, and a clothesline from which 2 children's shirts and a woman's practical dress were hanging in the afternoon breeze. He was still 40 yards from the house when the door opened, and Nellie Wainwright stepped onto the porch. He would think about that first moment many times in the years that followed. She was standing with one hand raised to shade her eyes against the afternoon sun, and she was wearing a plain brown dress and work boots, and her hair, which was the color of dark honey, or perhaps old bronze, or perhaps something that did not have a straightforward name, was pinned up in the practical manner of a woman who did not have time to fuss with it. She was 30 years old, though he would not learn that for several days. She had a face that was not conventionally beautiful in the way of parlor paintings, but was the kind of face that a man looked at and then looked at again, not because it was perfect but because it was interesting and honest, and when the sun caught it at that angle, remarkably arresting. She watched him ride up without moving from the porch. She did not look frightened, exactly. She looked assessed, like a woman who had learned to read the intentions of a man before he was close enough to speak. He stopped December at a respectful distance, dismounted, and removed his hat. "Mrs. Wainwright," he said, "I'm Cornelius Watkins. I wrote you the letter." "I know," she said. "I received it Wednesday." A pause in which they regarded each other. Behind her he could see a small face peering through the window, a boy's face, round and solemn. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I said I would. Men say a lot of things." "Yes, ma'am," he said, "they do. Some of them even mean it." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but might have been the preliminary to one. She stepped aside and held the door open. "Come inside then, Mr. Watkins. I'll make coffee." The interior of the house was small and scrubbed clean, with the kind of thoroughness that spoke of discipline and limited resources. There was a table with 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a shelf of dishes, a braided rug on the wooden floor, a settle bench against one wall, a curtained doorway that he understood led to the sleeping area. Everything was in order. Nothing was wasted. On the table, already set out and waiting, was an envelope that he recognized without needing to be told as the one containing Harlan Creed's paper. The boy Thomas appeared from behind the curtain, dark-eyed and watchful, and stood near his mother with the careful neutrality of a child who had decided to withhold judgment. "This is Thomas," Nellie said. "Thomas, this is Mr. Watkins. He's come to look at that paper." "Hello, Thomas," Cornelius said. Thomas said nothing, but he looked at Cornelius with the complete, unfiltered assessment of an 8-year-old boy, which is one of the more honest evaluations a man can receive. "Clara's sleeping," Nellie said, and moved to the stove to begin the coffee. Cornelius sat at the table, placed his hat on his knee, and reached for the envelope. "May I, please?" He drew out the paper and unfolded it carefully. It was, as he had suspected from the moment he read Nellie's letter, not a properly executed legal document. It was a promissory note, handwritten, with Franklin Wainwright's signature at the bottom, or what purported to be his signature, alongside Harlan Creed's considerably more confident script. The note claimed that Franklin Wainwright had borrowed the sum of $240 from Harlan Creed on the date of September the 14th, 1880, with the collateral being the land of the Wainwright claim, said collateral to transfer to Harlan Creed should the debt remain unpaid for 2 years from the date of signing. Cornelius read it twice. Then he set it on the table and was quiet for a moment. Nellie set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across the table with her own cup. Thomas had moved to the settle bench and was pretending to look at a picture book while actually watching Cornelius with complete attention. "What is it?" Nellie asked. Her voice was steady. She had clearly been preparing herself for what he might say. "A promissory note," Cornelius said. "It claims your husband borrowed money from this man Creed and offered the land as collateral." "I know what it claims," she said. "What I want to know is whether it's honest." He looked at her directly. She held his gaze without flinching, and he appreciated that more than he could have easily explained. "There are a few things worth noting," he said. "First, this note is not witnessed. Under Kansas territorial law, A deed agreement involving land requires at least one witness signature, and there isn't one here. Second, there's no notation of payment terms. It doesn't specify when or how the money was to be repaid, only the collateral and the date. Third, this date, September 14th, 1880, do you know where your husband was on that date? Nellie frowned, thinking. September of 1880. Franklin was at the harvest through most of September. He was helping the Baxter family 3 miles north of here for about 10 days. Would the Baxters remember that? Abner Baxter would. He's an honest man and his memory is good. Cornelius nodded slowly. Then there's the signature. I can't tell you for certain without comparing it to documents I know to be genuine, but the signature here has a different character than the one on the envelope of your letter, which I noticed had your husband's name in the return address in a different hand than yours. If that was Franklin's hand on the envelope. It was, she said quietly. I kept it, from before he passed. The letters F and W in his name had a particular loop that he always made. The F and W here are different. She was very still for a moment. Then she pressed her lips together and he saw the effort it took to hold her composure. He forged it. I believe so, yes. But I'm not a lawyer or a judge, and my belief isn't proof. What you need is someone who can examine the signatures properly, and a record of where Franklin was on that date, and possibly a lawyer who can make the argument that the document is invalid on multiple grounds. I don't have money for a lawyer. I know you said that. Let me think on it. She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, as if she were deciding something. Then she said, "Why are you here, Mr. Watkins? Truly, you don't know me. You didn't have to come." He considered the honest answer, which was that he had read her letter on a porch in Caldwell, and something in it had reached into his chest and taken hold of something he couldn't quite name, and that he had not been able to talk himself out of riding 40 miles in her direction, no matter how many reasonable arguments he had constructed against it. "Because you asked for help," he said, which was also true. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, as if that answered something, and lifted her coffee cup. In the days that followed, the situation with Harlan Creed became considerably clearer and considerably more complicated. Cornelius had not planned to stay more than the one day. He had planned to look at the document, offer what advice he could, and ride back to Caldwell. But by the end of that first afternoon, it was apparent to him that one day was not sufficient, and Nellie, with the practical directness that he was already coming to recognize as central to her character, pointed out that he was welcome to sleep in the barn if he needed another day, and that she would not be obligated to him for it. He stayed in the barn. December stayed in her small stable. Thomas, who had decided by the end of the first evening that Cornelius was probably not a threat, appeared in the barn doorway before sunrise on the second morning and said, without preamble, that the east fence had a broken post and that a coyote had been getting at the chickens. "I'll take a look at it," Cornelius said. He fixed the fence post. He also looked at the windmill, which had a mechanism that had been sticking, and adjusted it. He did not ask permission for either task, and did not call attention to either of them when they were done. Clara, who was 6 and had her mother's bronze honey hair and her own particular philosophy about strangers, appeared on the porch that second morning wearing a serious expression and carrying a rag doll of considerable age and wear. "Are you going to make the bad man go away?" she asked. "I'm going to try," he said. She considered this. "Mama cries at night," she said, "when she thinks we're sleeping." Cornelius looked at the little girl and felt something move in his chest that was not quite pain and not quite tenderness, but was the combination of the two that a person feels when the truth of another person's suffering becomes undeniable. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm going to do my best." Clara regarded him for another moment with the solemnity of a judge, then held out the rag doll. "You can hold Josephine if you want, she helps." He took the doll carefully in his large, calloused hands. "Thank you," he said. "That's kind of you." He rode to see Abner Baxter that second morning, with Nellie beside him on her own horse, a sensible gray mare named Ruth, and Thomas riding behind on a borrowed pony from the Baxter family. As it turned out, because Abner Baxter was the kind of neighbor who had kept the community together through hard winters and harder luck by sheer force of collective decency. Abner Baxter was 60 years old, lean and weathered, with a white beard and the kind of patient eyes that come from a life spent watching weather. He listened to what Cornelius laid out without interrupting. He examined the promissory note with reading glasses that he produced from his breast pocket. He looked at the date. September 14th, 1880, he said. I can tell you precisely where Franklin Wainwright was on that day. He was in my east field helping me bring in the last of the corn, same as he'd been for 9 days prior. My wife can confirm it, and so can my son Jacob and 2 hired men whose names I have written in my work ledger. Would you be willing to swear to that? Cornelius asked. On a Bible and in a court of law, if need be, Abner said firmly. Franklin Wainwright was an honest man. He worked my land and I worked his when seasons called for it. He never borrowed money from Harlan Creed or anyone else that I know of because Franklin was proud about owing. He'd rather have gone short than owed a man like Creed. Nellie, who had been listening with her hands folded in her lap, said quietly, he would have told me. I believe that, Abner said and looked at her with genuine warmth. You hold on, Nellie. This Creed fellow is a bully and a fraud. He's tried variations of this scheme before. I heard about something similar in the next county, some family that didn't have the information or the nerve to fight back. This time he picked the wrong widow. He glanced at Cornelius as he said it, and the 2 men exchanged a look of understanding. Harlan Creed appeared at Nellie's door on the following Monday morning, and Cornelius happened to be there. He had not staged it. He had ridden over from the small rooming house in town where he had taken a room, because 3 nights in the barn felt like one thing, and more than that felt like something that required more consideration of appearances in a small community. To discuss with Nellie a plan he had been working through about engaging a lawyer in Wichita by letter, when the sound of a horse approaching made him look up. The man who rode up was perhaps 45, with the look of someone who had been large and powerful in his younger years, and had since allowed himself to soften without losing the habit of using his size to intimidate. He was well dressed by Dust Creek standards, a good coat, polished boots, and he wore the particular expression of a man who assumed his presence was sufficient argument. He stopped his horse when he saw Cornelius standing on the porch beside Nellie, and something recalculated behind his eyes. Mrs. Wainwright, he said, not acknowledging Cornelius at all. I've come for your answer. My answer, Nellie said, is that my husband never signed that document, that he was 40 miles from you on the day you claim he did, and that Abner Baxter and his family will testify to that. My answer is that I've written to a lawyer in Wichita who has been informed of the fraudulent nature of your note. And my answer is no. Creed's gaze moved to Cornelius in a way that was meant to be threatening. Who are you? Nobody in particular, Cornelius said pleasantly. Just a man who happened to be standing here. You don't have any business in this matter. That's probably true, but here I am. The 2 men regarded each other. Creed was bigger, but Cornelius was younger and considerably more relaxed, which in such moments tends to carry its own weight. You'll be sorry for this, Creed said to Nellie, but still looking at Cornelius. Perhaps, Nellie said, but I don't think so. Good morning, Mr. Creed. For a long moment nothing moved. Then Creed wheeled his horse and rode back down the track, and Nellie let out a breath that was more than just air. It was weeks of dread, finally expelled. Cornelius looked at her. There was color high in her cheeks, and her chin was lifted, and her eyes were bright with something that was a mixture of triumph and relief, and the aftermath of genuine fear held under discipline, and he thought she was the most remarkable person he had encountered in a very long time. Well done, he said. She looked at him then, and for just a moment the formality between them slipped, and she was simply a woman looking at a man who had come when she needed someone to come, and she said, I could not have done this without you. You would have figured it out. Maybe eventually, she said, but he would have taken the land first. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the spring wind came around the corner of the house and stirred the clothesline, and somewhere behind the barn Thomas was calling to the chickens. "I should be getting back to Caldwell," Cornelius said, though something in his chest resisted the idea with more force than he expected. Nellie looked toward the east field where the new green of planted crops was just beginning to show. "You don't have to leave today," she said carefully. "There's still the matter of the lawyer in Wichita, and it would be helpful to have someone who understands these things nearby until the matter is properly settled." He understood that it cost her something to say that. She was not a woman who asked easily. "I could stay another few days," he said, "if that wouldn't be an inconvenience." "The barn is not an inconvenience," she said. "Then I'll stay." The days that followed were the most interesting week Cornelius had spent in years, which surprised him in the way that truly important things often do, quietly and without announcement. He helped Nellie with the claim work in the mornings, because there was always more to do than one person could manage. Fencing and planting and hauling and repairing, the endless physical negotiation of farming life on the Kansas plain. In the afternoons, they sat at her kitchen table and worked on the letter to the Wichita lawyer, a man named Prescott Alderman, who had been recommended by the county registrar, composing the details of the case with care and specificity. In the evenings, Thomas came and asked him questions about horses and cattle drives and distances, and Clara brought Josephine to sit near him, as though the rag doll's company were something she was generously sharing rather than freely offering, and Nellie sat by the lamp with her mending, and occasionally said something quiet and dry and funny that caught Cornelius entirely off guard each time, because he had not been expecting her to make him laugh, and then she did. She told him about Franklin. Not immediately, and not all at once, but in pieces, the way that honest people talk about grief when they've had time to look at it directly without being destroyed by it. Franklin Wainwright had been a good man, she said, a hard-working man, not brilliant, not remarkable, but steady and kind had been worth more than either of the other things, she thought. He had loved her and the children and had died at 34 from a rattlesnake bite that had gone bad in the heat, and she missed him still, but she had learned in the 14 months since that she was also a person who could stand independently when she had to, which was a knowledge she had not previously had the occasion to acquire. Cornelius listened to all of it without offering comfort that wasn't asked for, because he sensed that what she needed from these conversations was not sympathy, but simply a person who would hear her without trying to fix what could not be fixed. He respected what she had carried and did not attempt to diminish it by suggesting it was less than it was. He told her some things about himself in return. He had come to Kansas from Virginia at the age of 19, following an older brother who had come west and then died of cholera on the Arkansas River in the winter of 1870, which had left Cornelius with a piece of land the brother had claimed and no particular plan. He had worked cattle drives for 6 years after that, up to Abilene and Dodge City, learning the country and the work and the kind of men who populated it, the honest ones and the otherwise. He had used the money to build a small ranch outside Caldwell, which he had run alone for the past 4 years and which was modest but was his. "Don't you get lonely?" Nellie asked one evening, not looking up from her mending. He considered the question seriously rather than deflecting it. "Yes," he said. "I do." She looked up then briefly and then back down. "I thought so," she said. "You have the look of it." "What does that look like?" "Like a man who knows how to be comfortable alone, but hasn't confused that with being happy." He was quiet for a moment. "That's precisely it," he said. The reply from Prescott Alderman arrived 11 days after they sent the letter, and it was encouraging. The lawyer had examined the information they had provided and was of the opinion that the promissory note would not withstand legal scrutiny, particularly given the witness testimony of Abner Baxter and the discrepancy in signatures. He recommended that Nellie file a formal complaint with the county court and offered to take the case for a fee that was considerably more modest than Cornelius had feared. adding in a note that appeared to have been added in a separate handwriting, as a postscript that he had heard of Harlan Creed's particular method of operation from another quarter, and was inclined to see the matter properly settled. Nellie read the letter at the kitchen table with Thomas leaning against her arm and Clara on her lap, and when she finished reading it, she put it down flat on the table and pressed both hands over it and closed her eyes for a moment that Cornelius did not intrude upon. When she opened her eyes, Thomas said, "Does that mean the bad man can't take our land?" "That means he cannot," Nellie said. "Good," Thomas said, with the complete and uncomplicated satisfaction of a child for whom justice is not yet complicated by experience. "Because Mr. Watkins fixed the fence and I don't want it to be anyone else's fence." Nellie looked across the table at Cornelius, and her eyes were wet just slightly at the corners, and she did not look away. He had been intending to ride back to Caldwell the following day. He had been intending this for some time. His ranch needed attention, and Reverend Hatch would have recovered by now and might wonder what had become of his correspondence, and there were 100 practical reasons for him to go back to his own life. He did not go back the following day. He went back 2 days later, after helping Nellie replant the north section of the kitchen garden, where a late frost had taken the first planting, and fixing the windmill mechanism properly this time, and spending a long Saturday afternoon teaching Thomas to throw a rope, which Thomas proved to have a natural aptitude for that delighted him completely. The morning he left, Nellie stood on the porch with Clara holding her hand and Thomas a little apart, trying to look unconcerned in the way of small boys who are very concerned. "Thank you," Nellie said, "for everything. I don't have words adequate to it." "You don't need them," he said. "I'll be back this way in 2 weeks. I'd like to know how the matter with Creed progresses." He had not planned to say that. It arrived fully formed out of something more honest than planning. She looked at him steadily. 2 weeks, she said. "Yes. Then I'll make sure the coffee is ready." He rode back to Caldwell, with December's easy stride beneath him and the wide Kansas sky above, and something in his chest that was warm and complicated and entirely new to the geography of him. Reverend Hatch, recovered from his fever and inclined toward gratitude and questions in equal measure, listened to the account of what had transpired, and looked at Cornelius over the rim of his own coffee cup with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years reading people from a pulpit. "This widow," the Reverend said, "Nellie Wainwright, yes, you found the situation difficult to leave. The legal matter was not yet resolved. Cornelius." A pause. "She is a remarkable woman," Cornelius said. Reverend Hatch smiled into his coffee. "Go back in 2 weeks," he said, "and perhaps bring something, not as charity as courtesy." "She specifically said she didn't want charity." "I said courtesy. There is a distinction. Bring seeds if she's gardening. Bring a book if she reads. Bring something that says I noticed what mattered to you, not something that says I think you need help. Any woman worth her salt can tell the difference." Cornelius thought about this for the rest of the day. He brought seeds. He also, after standing in the Caldwell Mercantile for an embarrassing amount of time, brought a small tin of good coffee, because the coffee at Nellie's house was the kind of coffee that told the story of careful rationing, and he thought she deserved to drink good coffee without having to portion it out. He rode back on a Friday 2 weeks later, and this time there was something different in the quality of arriving, something that felt less like visiting and more like returning, which was a distinction he noticed and filed away without knowing quite what to do with it yet. Thomas saw him coming from a quarter-mile off and came running across the field in a way that suggested he had been watching the road, which Cornelius did not comment on because that would have embarrassed the boy. The legal matter had progressed as Prescott alderman had indicated it would. Nellie had filed the complaint. Harlan Creed had hired a lawyer of his own, but the case against the promissory note was solid, and the lawyer Creed hired was, as Abner Baxter put it when Cornelius met him in town, a man of flexible ethics and insufficient talent, which was a combination that did not tend toward favorable outcomes. The case was heard before the county judge in late May of 1882, on a Tuesday that was bright and hot and smelled of the approaching summer. Cornelius rode to the county seat with Nellie. Thomas and Clara had been left with the Baxter family, and he sat beside her in the courtroom, which was also the town hall, and on Sundays the meeting room for the local temperance society, and listened as Prescott Alderman, who proved to be a sharp-minded small man of about 50 with the focused energy of a terrier, laid out the case with the methodical precision of someone who enjoyed this kind of work. Abner Baxter testified. Two of Baxter's neighbors, who had also known Franklin Wainwright, testified. A handwriting examiner from Wichita, whom Alderman had engaged at reduced cost, testified that the signature on the promissory note did not match 3 other samples of Franklin Wainwright's hand that had been recovered from county land records. Harlan Creed sat at the other table and wore the expression of a man who was reconsidering his choices, which was, Cornelius thought, about 20 years later than he should have. The judge, a compact man of middle age with the patient manner of someone who had seen enough of human dishonesty to have stopped being surprised by it, but had not stopped being disgusted, ruled in Nellie's favor in language that left no ambiguity. The promissory note was fraudulent. The land was Nellie Wainwright's by right and law. He further referred the matter of the forgery to the appropriate authorities for consideration of criminal charges, which was a development that made Harlan Creed go the color of old tallow. Nellie did not make any sound or expression of triumph in the courtroom. She sat straight and composed until the judge left the bench. Then she stood, and Cornelius stood beside her, and she turned and looked at him, and she said, very quietly, "He can't take it." "No," Cornelius said, "he cannot." She pressed her lips together and nodded. Then she reached out and took his hand, just for a moment, the way that people reach for something solid when the ground has finally stopped moving under them, and he held her hand and did not make anything of it, and did not let go until she did. They ate supper at the hotel restaurant in the county seat, which was the first meal either of them had eaten in a dining room in some time, and which felt like a celebration without anyone having to call it that. Nellie ordered the roasted chicken and ate with the quiet pleasure of someone eating food she had not had to cook herself. And she told him about the summer she had spent the first year of her marriage learning to make bread in a fire-damaged stove that produced heat in an entirely personal and unpredictable manner, and he laughed more genuinely than he had laughed in months. They rode home in the long summer evening, with the light going golden across the prairie grass, and the meadowlarks calling their last rounds of the day, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. At her gate he stopped December and she stopped Ruth, and they sat in the cooling air with a foot of space between them that felt like a very particular kind of distance. "You'll come back again," she said. It was not quite a question. "I intend to," he said. "Then I'll count on it." He rode back to Caldwell under the rising stars, thinking about the way her hand had felt in his in the courtroom, and about the sound of her laughing over the bread story, and about the particular way she said precisely certain things as if she were measuring the value of the words before she spent them, and about how Thomas had said he didn't want it to be anyone else's fence. He came back 3 weeks later, and 2 weeks after that, and the visits began to have a rhythm to them: Friday arrival, Monday departure, with the work of the claim and the evenings at the lamp and the meals at the kitchen table, and the gradual accumulation of knowing each other becoming something that was clearly, to anyone paying attention, more than neighborly assistance with a legal matter. Abner Baxter was paying attention. So were the people at the Dust Creek Mercantile. So, in the transparent and completely sincere way of children, were Thomas and Clara, who had ceased treating Cornelius's arrivals as events of any particular note, and had simply incorporated him into the landscape of their lives in the way that children incorporate what they accept as permanent. One evening in July, after the children were asleep behind the curtain and the lamp was turned low, and the night sounds of the Kansas summer came through the single open window crickets and the distant call of something in the dark grass. Nellie set down her mending and looked at him directly across the table. "I need to say something," she said, "and I am going to say it plainly because I do not know another way, and I would not trust myself to find the right words if I spent more time looking for them." He set down the piece of harness he had been mending and gave her his full attention. "When I wrote that letter to Reverend Hatch," she said, "I was asking for information, a resource, a practical solution to a practical problem. I was not asking for anything else because it did not occur to me to ask for anything else, and also because I had long since persuaded myself that what I had had with Franklin was enough for one life, and I was not the sort of person who expected more than one good thing." She paused. He waited. "I do not know what you feel," she said. "I will not assume. But I know what I feel, and I have spent 6 weeks trying to talk myself out of it by being sensible, and I find that I'm not as sensible as I thought. What I feel is that every Friday I know you're coming I am more alive than I was the days before it. And every Monday after you leave there is a particular kind of quiet that wasn't there before you started coming. And that isn't friendship, Mr. Watkins, though it contains friendship. And I thought it was only fair to tell you plainly, because you have been straight with me from the beginning and you deserve the same." The lamp flame moved in some small motion of air from the window. Cornelius looked at Nellie Wainwright across the table, at her honesty and her exhausted courage, and the particular way her eyes did not waver even though he could see that this had cost her, and he said, "Nellie." It was the first time he had used her first name. "Cornelius," she said back, and the name in her mouth sounded like something it had never sounded like when he said it in his own head. "I have been thinking about this since approximately the first time I read your letter on Reverend Hatch's porch," he said. "I have been trying to be respectful of your situation and your grief and your independence, all of which you have earned. I have not wanted to be another man appearing at your door with something you didn't ask for." "What is it you have?" she asked. "That you haven't offered. My full regard," he said, "which is, I don't have a better way to say this, which is considerable." The quiet between them was different now. It was the quiet of something arrived at. "I think," Nellie said slowly, "that I would like to know what that looks like if you're willing to show me." "I am," he said. "I very much am." He reached across the table, and she met him halfway, her hand turning over to meet his, and they sat there in the low lamplight with the summer night pouring through the window and the sound of the children breathing behind the curtain. And it was not dramatic in the way of novels or performances, but it was true in the way of things that have been earned. And it was, Cornelius thought, more than he had expected from any version of any life he had ever imagined for himself. The courtship, if that is the right word for what followed, was conducted in the honest and unhurried manner of two people who had both made their peace with difficulty and were not inclined to rush something they valued. He continued to come on Fridays. He stayed through Monday, sometimes through Tuesday when the work demanded it. He helped with the claim. She helped him think through a problem he was having with the south pasture at his ranch in Caldwell, offering practical suggestions that proved correct. They talked about everything history and weather, and the particular injustices of territorial politics, about which Nellie had strong and well-reasoned opinions. She was aware, and said so directly, that the law had been designed around the assumption of a man's presence, and that women who found themselves managing land and children and legal disputes alone were navigating a system that had not considered their existence worth legislating for, and that this was wrong, and that it needed to change, and that she intended to say so when she had the opportunity, which she did publicly. At a town meeting in August that Cornelius attended with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a person be entirely themselves, in September he asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. He did not kneel, because the kitchen floor was hard and his knees were 31 years old, and he thought Nellie would have laughed at the kneeling anyway, fondly but genuinely. He did it at the end of a Sunday evening when the children were in bed and the lamp was burning and the first hint of autumn was in the air through the window. "I'd like to marry you," he said, "if you're willing. Not because you need someone, because I know by now that you don't need anyone. You're capable of standing alone and you've proven it. But because I'd rather stand beside you than anywhere else I can think of, and I believe you feel something similar, and I think Thomas and Clara deserve a father who is present and consistent and means what he says, and I would like to be that to them if you'll allow it. And I would like," he paused, and something that was not quite vulnerability but was adjacent to it moved across his face. "I would like to stop going back to Caldwell on Mondays." Nellie was quiet for a moment that was longer than the previous kind of quiet. "I have been thinking about this," she said. "I assumed you had. I have thought about whether I am doing it too soon, because Franklin has been gone for less than 2 years and people will say things, and whether I am being sensible about it, and whether the fact that you make me feel safe in a way I had forgotten it was possible to feel means that I am responding to safety rather than to you specifically. And what have you concluded?" She looked at him directly. "That you are the specific reason," she said. "Not safety in general, you in particular. The way you listened when I talked about Franklin without trying to replace him. The way you fixed the fence before I knew you'd done it. The way you held Clara's rag doll. The way you have never once treated me as less capable than I am, even while helping me. Those are not qualities of a general category, Cornelius. Those are yours." He looked at her and felt something that was too large for whatever vessel he had been keeping it in. "Then yes," she said, "I'll marry you. I would very much like to marry you." He exhaled a breath he had apparently been holding for some time. She laughed then, a genuine, warm laugh that lit her whole face, and said, "Were you nervous?" "Considerably," he admitted. "Good," she said, still laughing softly. "It would have been a little worrying if you weren't. They told the children in the morning." Thomas listened with the concentrated attention of a boy processing significant information, and then he said, "Does this mean you'll live here?" "It does," Cornelius said. "What about your ranch in Caldwell?" "I'll sell it or find someone to run it. Your mother's claim is a good piece of land and it already has everything I need." Thomas considered this. "Will you still teach me rope throwing? Every week?" "All right," Thomas said, with the air of a businessman who has concluded satisfactory negotiations. "I think that's a good idea, then." Clara, who had been listening to all of this from the chair where she sat with Josephine, said, "Can I be a flower girl at the wedding?" "There is no one I would rather have," Nellie said. Clara beamed. "I'm going to tell Josephine," she said, and retreated to the settle bench to deliver the news. The wedding was held in October of 1882 at the Dust Creek Church with the listing steeple, on a Saturday afternoon when the sky was the deep blue of high autumn and the cottonwood trees along the creek had gone yellow and gold. Reverend Hatch, fully recovered and apparently feeling a personal investment in this particular union, rode the 40 miles from Caldwell to perform the ceremony. He appeared at Cornelius's side beforehand and shook his hand and said, "You handled her correspondence rather more thoroughly than I expected." And Cornelius said, "You should take better care of your envelopes." And Reverend Hatch laughed with genuine delight. Abner Baxter was there, and his wife and son, and half of Dust Creek, because in a small community a wedding is both celebration and occasion. And Nellie Wainwright marrying the man who had come and helped when she needed it was the kind of story that a community recognized as worth gathering around. Clara was the flower girl, scattering dried wildflower petals with an expression of supreme satisfaction. Thomas stood beside Cornelius as something between a best man and a witness, wearing the look of a boy who was doing something he understood to be important and intended to do correctly. Nellie wore a dress of dark blue wool. It was October, and there was no good reason for muslin, that she had made herself in the weeks prior, and she had done something different with her hair, allowing it to be less tightly pinned than usual so that the bronze honey color of it showed fully in the autumn light that came through the church windows. And Cornelius looked at her walking toward him up the aisle on Abner Baxter's arm, and felt something so complete that it was almost disorienting. Reverend Hatch officiated with the particular warmth of a man who knew both parties and found the whole proceeding to be exactly as it should be. The vows were the traditional ones. Cornelius said them in the direct, steady way that he did most things, looking at Nellie the entire time. Nellie said them with the same precision she gave to any important statement, and when she reached the end of hers she added quietly, in a moment that was between the two of them and not the room, "I mean all of it." "I know," he said. "So do I." They were married, and the room did what rooms do at such moments, which is to say it became very warm and briefly very loud. That evening there was a gathering at the Baxter farm because the church was too small, and there was food and music from a fiddle and a guitar played by two brothers from the east side of the county, who had the natural ease of people who had learned music for pleasure. And people danced on the flat ground behind the house in the cool autumn evening under a sky full of early stars. Cornelius danced with Nellie 3 times, which was twice more than could be called strictly necessary, and each time felt different in a way that he could not have articulated and did not try to. He danced once with Clara, who stood on his feet and shrieked with laughter at the movement. He watched Thomas dance a careful two-step with the Baxter granddaughter and look extraordinarily serious about it, which made Nellie laugh until she had to wipe her eyes. When they drove home in the wagon in the dark, the children asleep in the back under a blanket, the stars enormous overhead and the night air smelling of grass and cold and the distant wood smoke of distant houses, Nellie leaned against his shoulder and he drove one-handed, and he thought that this was perhaps the best he had ever felt in his life and that he intended to say so when they got home. He said so. She said, "Me too." The first winter they were married was a hard one, as Kansas winters often were, cold that came in off the flat land without apology and stayed, wind that found every gap in the construction of the soddy's wooden additions, snow that fell honest and heavy and lay on the ground for weeks at a time. But it was also the first winter in nearly 2 years that Nellie had not faced it alone, and that difference was not small. Cornelius had settled into the Wainwright claim with the practical thoroughness of a man who understood that the most useful thing he could offer was labor and competence. He reinforced the walls against the cold. He built a better windbreak for the animals. He repatched the barn roof in November, before the worst of the weather, working in the last of the autumn warmth with Thomas handing him boards from the ground, both of them talking in the unhurried way of people doing physical work together. Thomas had taken to him in the complete way that children take to people they have decided to trust, which is to say without reservation or irony, and with a degree of enthusiasm that was occasionally overwhelming. He wanted to learn everything: the roping, the saddle-making, the reading of the stars for navigation, which Cornelius had learned on cattle drives, the names of cloud types, which Cornelius had learned by necessity, the proper care of a horse, which Cornelius considered perhaps the most important of all. Clara had adopted him entirely and without conditions from the very early days, in the manner of a 6-year-old who had decided and saw no reason to revisit the decision. She called him Papa by the end of the first month without preamble, and the first time she did it, he had to find something to attend to outside because his face did things he was not prepared to have witnessed. Nellie saw. She said nothing, but later that evening she reached over and took his hand at the table, just briefly, and he understood that she had seen and that she understood, and that no additional words were required. In February of 1883, Harlan Creed was formally charged with land fraud in connection with both the Wainwright case and 2 similar cases in the adjacent county that had come to light during the investigation. The charges were filed, and the case was scheduled for a spring court date, and Cornelius made sure Nellie had Prescott Alderman's most recent letter on hand, and that she understood precisely where things stood, which was to say solidly in her favor. Creed left the territory before his court date. He was found in Missouri some months later and returned to face the charges, which ultimately resulted in his being found guilty of fraud and sentenced accordingly. Nellie received a letter from Prescott Alderman that summer informing her of the verdict, and she read it at the kitchen table and then folded it and set it in the tin box where she kept important papers, and that was the end of Harlan Creed as any sort of presence in their lives. "It's done," she told Cornelius that evening. "Good," he said. "Now it's finished." She nodded slowly. "Franklin would have been angry about it for a year," she said, not unkindly. "He tended to carry things. I think it's better to set them down." "I think you're right," Cornelius said. "I usually am," she said, with the dry precision that still caught him off guard after months of it, and he laughed. Spring came and brought with it the particular renewal of energy that is unique to people who have survived a hard winter together. A sense of shared accomplishment that goes beyond the practical, a satisfaction in having held against something difficult and found that the holding brought you closer together rather than wearing you apart. Cornelius planted the east field alongside Thomas, who was 9 now, and had the focused determination of a boy who had decided that farming was serious work and intended to do it seriously. Nellie expanded the kitchen garden, adding 3 new rows and a section for herbs, and she did it with a sense of ownership that was different from the ownership of necessity. It was the ownership of choice, which is a different and better thing. In April, Nellie told him that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before the children were up, while the spring light was just beginning to come through the window and the coffee was on the stove. She said it plainly as she said everything, but he saw the uncertainty in her face, not about the child but about him, about what he felt, about whether this was welcomed. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her, which was perhaps not the articulate response the moment called for but was the one that arrived first, and he held her long enough for the uncertainty to leave her expression when he pulled back to look at her. "This is Nellie, this is the best news I have had in," he stopped. "In your life," she offered. "In my life," he agreed. "Yes." She let out a breath and smiled, and it was the particular smile that she saved for moments of genuine happiness wider than her usual ones, reaching her eyes fully, making her whole face different. "I wasn't sure how you'd feel," she said. "Thoroughly glad," he said. "In case that wasn't clear." "It was clear," she said. "I just needed to hear it." Thomas took the news with the thoughtful solemnity of a 9-year-old processing a significant change. His primary concern, expressed after considerable reflection, was whether the baby would be loud, because he found loudness disruptive to his concentration when he was learning things. Cornelius told him that yes, babies tended to be loud, but that he suspected Thomas would adjust. Thomas accepted this with the pragmatism of a boy who had already adjusted to a great deal. Clara's response was immediate and total delight. She informed Josephine immediately and spent 3 days telling everyone in Dust Creek about the forthcoming baby, including people she didn't know particularly well. Nellie, overhearing one of these announcements at the Mercantile, said to Cornelius quietly, "I believe the whole of the county will know by the end of the week." "The fiddle players probably already do," he said. She laughed. "Probably." The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which was a relief and a grace that both of them acknowledged with the specific gratitude of people who know how many ways things can go wrong, and how much it means when they don't. Nellie was strong through all of it, with the practical endurance of a woman who did not have the habit of fragility, though Cornelius made certain that the hardest physical work of the claim fell to him through the summer and fall months, not from condescension, but from the simple logic that he was available and capable, and had no interest in gambling with something irreplaceable. There were evenings in that summer and fall of 1883 when the particular quality of everything around him, the house they had together, made genuinely warm. The children's voices from the other side of the curtain, Nellie beside him in the lamp's light with the slight but unmistakable change of her shape under her dress, the sound of the Kansas wind having its familiar conversation with the windmill, seemed to Cornelius to be more than he had any right to expect from a life that had, for a long time, been lived in the company of solitude. He said something like this to Nellie one October evening, not quite this articulately, because he was not a particularly articulate man when it came to feelings, but in the rough and direct way he had of saying the important things. She looked at him for a moment after he said it, and then she said, "I know exactly what you mean. I feel the same, every day. I want you to know that I'm grateful," he said, "for all of it, for you." "Cornelius," she said, with the particular steadiness of someone saying the truest thing they know, "I am grateful for you every single day. Every day since you arrived on that horse and took your hat off and said my name." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the lamp burned steady, and the wind said its piece outside, and it was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough. The baby arrived in November of 1883, on a night when the first serious snow of the season was falling past the windows in thick, unhurried flakes. The Dust Creek midwife, a capable and sensible woman named Mrs. Holbrook, arrived in good time and managed everything with the calm competence of someone who had brought many dozens of children into the world and had no intention of losing this one. Cornelius spent the hours of the labor on the other side of the curtain, first with Thomas and Clara, and then, when he had settled them into sleep with some difficulty, alone, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded and not attempting to pretend he was doing anything other than waiting and hoping in equal measure. The baby was born just before midnight, and when Cornelius heard the first cry, that specific, astonishing cry that is unlike anything else in the world, he pressed his knuckles against his mouth for a moment and breathed. Mrs. Holbrook appeared at the curtain. "A son," she said, "healthy and loud. Your wife is well. You can come through." He had seen a great many things in his life. He had worked cattle through blizzards and driven horses through summer heat that split the earth. He had been in the territory when it was rougher than it was now, and had seen things that were not gentle. None of it had prepared him for the sight of Nellie sitting against the pillows with a newborn son in the crook of her arm, exhausted to the bone, and glowing with some light that he could only call what it was, which was joy. She looked up at him when he came in, and her face did the thing that he had been cataloging since the first day, that particular opening, that particular welcome that she reserved. He had come to understand, for him alone. "Come and see him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby. The baby was red-faced and squinting and entirely certain of his own rightness in the universe in the way of all newborns. "He's remarkable," Cornelius said, and meant it with everything he had. "He is," Nellie agreed. "I think we should call him Joseph, if you agree." "Joseph Watkins," he said. "Yes, I agree." She leaned against his arm carefully, around the baby between them, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat like that in the warm room with the snow falling outside, and the lamp burning, and Joseph Wainwright Watkins, because they had decided to give him both names, which felt correct, and which both Nellie and Thomas agreed was exactly right, sleeping in his mother's arms with the complete trust of a person who does not yet know that the world contains difficulty. And for this particular night, that was entirely as it should be. In the morning, Thomas and Clara met their brother. Thomas's response was more emotional than he would have wanted acknowledged, and he recovered from it quickly by asking several detailed practical questions about infant care, which was his way. Clara held the baby with the gravity of a child performing an important duty, and told him that Josephine was very glad to meet him. The years that followed built themselves like the claim had been built, not all at once, not with any dramatic architecture, but with the daily accumulation of honest effort and the specific satisfaction of a life that was going in the right direction. Thomas grew into a young man of serious intelligence and genuine capability, taking on more of the farm work as he reached his teens and developing, in addition to the roping, a considerable aptitude for the mechanical side of farm equipment, which was increasingly relevant as agricultural machinery improved through the decade. By the time he was 14, He was the person anyone in Dust Creek came to when something complicated needed fixing. He had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and he had, somewhere along the way, started calling Cornelius Pa without it seeming like a decision, just an arrival. Clara grew up with the warmth and social ease that had been obvious from early childhood, developing into a girl who knew every family in the county and cared about all of them, and had a particular gift for making people feel understood, which is perhaps the rarest gift. She kept Josephine on a shelf in her room long past the age when most children abandon their dolls, because she said Josephine had history and history deserved respect, which was the kind of statement that made Nellie and Cornelius look at each other over her head. Joseph grew up in the middle of all of it, the youngest and the most surprising, inheriting some quality from the combination of his parents that manifested as a kind of fearless curiosity about everything. He wanted to know how the windmill worked, and why the stars moved, and what the medicine contained, and where the river went, and he wore Cornelius out on a regular basis with these questions, while simultaneously being the person Cornelius loved talking to most, because there is something specific and irreplaceable in being asked genuine questions by someone who genuinely wants to know the answers. In the spring of 1886, Nellie found out she was expecting again. "Twice more," she said to Cornelius, with a composure that he suspected concealed both joy and a certain practical resignation about the immediate future. "Is that what you'd like?" he asked. She looked at him. "Is it what you'd like?" I asked first. "Yes," she said. "2 more, and then I think we'll have built what we set out to build." "Then yes," he said. "That's what I'd like." The second child was a girl, born in October of 1886 on a day so warm and golden that it seemed like an argument against the approaching winter, and they named her Martha after Cornelius's mother, who had died in Virginia when he was 17, and whom he had missed ever since in the way one misses people whose kind of love was specific and unrepeatable. Martha Watkins was golden-haired and stubborn from the first moments in a way that predicted a personality of considerable force, and she proved those predictions correct every day of her early life, with a thoroughness that both exhausted and delighted everyone in the household. The third child came in 1889, a second son, named Franklin, which was Nellie's suggestion, and which Cornelius agreed to immediately and without reservation, because he understood what it meant and he thought it was the right thing to do, to carry the name of the man who had loved this woman and these children before him, and who had been a good man in the ways that had mattered, and who deserved to be remembered in something that would grow. Franklin Watkins was born quiet and observant, a child who watched everything with large, steady eyes and seemed to be taking notes, and who spoke in full sentences from an early age and had opinions about everything before he was 3 years old, which meant that family mealtimes became a particular and specific kind of lively. The claim had expanded by this time. They had purchased the adjacent piece of ground in 1885 when its previous owners moved further west, adding to the cultivated area and the grazing land, and Cornelius had hired 2 hands to help manage the increased acreage, brothers named Eli and Sam Dorsey, who were honest workers and decent men, and who became part of the daily life of the place in the way that good hired men do. Not quite family, and not quite employees, but something in the middle that the West had made its own category. The Dust Creek community had changed over the decade. As all small communities on the frontier did, some families had left, pressed out by drought or debt or the simple lure of somewhere else, and new families had come in, and the town itself had grown in modest ways. A new school building, an improved post office, a second mercantile, a telegraph office that had arrived in 1885 and changed the texture of communication with the wider world in ways that still seemed remarkable to people who remembered when news traveled at the speed of a horse. Nellie had become, gradually and without quite meaning to, a central figure in the Dust Creek community in a way that had nothing to do with her husband and everything to do with who she was. She organized the school board when the new school was built and served on it for 5 years with the precision and determination that she brought to everything she cared about. She was part of the group of women who pushed, successfully, for the school to have a proper library, which she stocked partly through donation and partly through correspondence with a book society in Kansas City that she had found out about through a notice in a territorial newspaper. She was outspoken about the legal status of women and property, which had been the issue of her own survival, and she spoke about it publicly and without apology. In 1887, she stood up at a town meeting and made an argument about women's right to hold property independently of their husbands' debts that was so precise and so well-reasoned that even the men who had come to the meeting opposed to the idea left it uncertain, which was as much as you could often hope for in the territorial Kansas of the 1880s. Cornelius sat in the back of the room at that meeting and listened to his wife make that argument and felt the particular pride that is not proprietary but is witnessing, the feeling of seeing someone be fully themselves in public and understanding that you are one of the few people who knows the whole of them, and that this is an immense privilege. Reverend Hatch came to visit in the summer of 1887, making the 40-mile journey in a buggy that was better suited to the distance than a horse at his age, and sat at the Wainwright Watkins dinner table with Thomas, who was now 13, and Clara, who was 11, and Joseph, who was 4 and was currently conducting a philosophical investigation into whether the gravy contained anything suspicious. And he looked around the table at all of it, and at Nellie and Cornelius, and he said, "With great satisfaction, I believe the outcome of that particular bit of correspondence was considerably better than anything I would have arranged." "You were very ill," Cornelius pointed out. "Providentially so," Reverend Hatch said, and helped himself to more bread. The years moved as years do, faster in retrospect than in the living of them, and fuller than could be easily summarized. There were hard seasons. A drought in 1888 that tested the land and everyone on it. A winter in 1890 that Thomas called the worst and Cornelius privately agreed. A period when the cattle prices fell so low that several neighboring families sold and moved east, and the community contracted in ways that felt like losses. But there were also the good things. The seasons when the crops came in heavy, and the cellar filled with abundance. The Christmas mornings when the children filled the house with noise and the particular electricity of childhood joy. The evenings when the older children were out and the younger ones were sleeping, and the house was quiet, and Cornelius and Nellie sat by the lamp and talked about everything and nothing, in the way of people who have built something together and are still interested in each other after years of construction. He had not expected that. He had not expected that years of marriage would increase rather than diminish his interest in his wife. He had assumed, without quite knowing he had assumed it, that familiarity would produce a comfortable plateau, a reliable warmth that was real but not urgent. Instead, he found that knowing Nellie better only produced more things to know, more layers of her that revealed themselves over time. Her specific sense of humor that required knowing the history to catch the reference, her particular brand of stubbornness that was different in the context of something she truly believed from the stubbornness she deployed in arguments, her tenderness with the children that she expressed through practicality rather than sentiment but was no less genuine for that, her capacity for learning. She had taught herself bookkeeping and was managing the farm's accounts by 1887. And had begun reading widely through the school library in history and philosophy and natural science, and she brought what she read back to the kitchen table, and it changed the texture of their evenings in ways he found endlessly interesting. She was, he thought regularly, the most interesting person he knew. He told her so. "You say that," she told him once with a half-smile, "because you know me. Anyone is interesting if you know them properly." "Not everyone," he said. She considered this. "Perhaps not," she allowed. "Thomas married at the age of 20 in the fall of 1894. The girl was named Hannah Morse, from a family who had come to the territory from Ohio 5 years earlier, and she was steady and quick, and had a particular fondness for the mechanical work that Thomas loved, which turned out to be an excellent basis for partnership. Nellie received her with the warmth of a woman who understood what it meant to need someone to stand beside you and was glad her son had found it. Clara, who had grown into a woman of considerable social grace and warm intelligence, had several candidates for her affections through her late teens and early 20s, none of whom she considered quite right until she was 23, at which point she announced she had decided on Daniel Holt, who ran the telegraph office in Dusk Creek and had, she said, the patience of a man who spent all day receiving messages and the specific quality of listening fully before responding, which she found irresistible. They were married in 1899, and Clara, with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did, organized a wedding that was the best party the county had seen in years. Through all of it, Cornelius and Nellie remained the center of the household, in the way that the oldest trees in a wood are not the most dramatic, but are the ones everything else has organized around. They were the reference point, the standard, the place the children came back to when things were good and when things were hard, and when they needed someone who knew the whole of them. There was a particular evening in the summer of 1895, when Joseph was 11, and Martha was 9, and Franklin was 6, and Thomas and Hannah had come to supper with the news that they were expecting their first child, which made Nellie grandmother and Cornelius grandfather at 43 and 44 respectively, which seemed to both of them slightly improbable. After supper, when the younger children had gone to bed and Thomas and Hannah had driven home in their wagon, Cornelius and Nellie sat on the front porch in the summer evening, a proper front porch now, added to the house by degrees over the years until it had become one of the things Cornelius valued most about the place, and listened to the Kansas night and watched the lightning bugs moving in slow patterns over the grass. "We're going to be grandparents," Nellie said. "We are. How do you feel about it?" "Old," he said, "and very grateful," she laughed quietly. "I feel the same, both things." They sat for a while with the night around them. "I have been thinking," Nellie said, "about that letter." "Which letter?" "The one I wrote to Reverend Hatch." "Ah," he said, "I have thought about it many times over the years, about how close it came to going differently, if the fever had broken 2 days earlier, if the envelope had sealed properly, if you had been a different kind of man. Those are a lot of ifs." "Yes," she said, "they are. I try not to carry them because they lead to places that haven't happened and the speculation is exhausting. But sometimes I look at all of this," she gestured, a small motion that encompassed the porch and the house and the land and the lightning bugs and the sound of the children inside and everything they had built, "and I think about how none of it was what I wrote that letter for. I wrote it for help with a document, and I got—" She stopped. "This," he said. "This," she agreed. "Everything, 13 years of everything." He looked at her in the evening light, at the face that he could have drawn from memory at any hour of any day, at the bronze honey hair that had threads of silver in it now, at the temples that he found beautiful in a way she sometimes protested, at the particular quality of her stillness when she was thinking. "Nellie," he said. "Cornelius," she said back, in the voice she had used when she said his name for the first time across the kitchen table in the lamplight in 1882, and which still had the same effect on him. "I am going to tell you something and you are not going to deflect it," he said. "That depends on what it is." "On the day I read your letter on Reverend Hatch's porch," he said, "I did not know you existed. By the end of the day I could not imagine how I had managed not knowing you, and every day since has confirmed the impossibility of the version of my life without you in it." She was quiet. Then she said, not deflecting, "I feel that exactly." "I know," he said, "I know you do." "Say the rest," she said. "You had more." He smiled at that. She had always been able to tell when there was more. "You have made every part of this life better and larger and more interesting than it would have been without you. You have given me children that I would not trade for any other life I could have lived. You have made me better at being a person by the simple example of how thoroughly you are yourself, and I am grateful every day." She reached over and took his hand in the dark. "You know what I think," she said after a moment. "Tell me." "I think Reverend Hatch was lucky to have such an attentive neighbor." He laughed genuinely and fully, out into the Kansas summer night, and she laughed with him, and the lightning bugs continued their slow, golden patterns over the grass, and the children's voices drifted from inside the house, and Thomas's baby, their grandchild, the thought of it still surprising, was coming in the fall, and the claim was solid, and the crops were good, and the fence posts were properly set, all of them, and the windmill turned with ease in the night breeze. Thomas's son was born in November of 1895, a boy they named Cornelius Wainwright Watkins. The combination of names was Thomas's doing, offered with the quiet determination of a 21-year-old man honoring two things at once, and it moved Cornelius more than he had words for, and he did not try to have words for it because Nellie was there, and she understood without him needing them. Martha grew into the force of personality she had always promised to be, becoming a schoolteacher in Dust Creek in her early 20s, and later one of the first women in the county to serve on a school district board. Franklin, the observant and philosophical youngest son, went to study at a college in Kansas City at 19, which was a thing that Nellie had made possible by insisting through his entire childhood that education was a right and a resource and worth investing in. And he came back 3 years later with a degree and a keen mind, and a determination to practice law, which he did, and which made his mother laugh with a specific and satisfied quality that Cornelius recognized as the laugh of someone seeing a long-held intention arrive at its destination. The land dispute that had brought Cornelius to Dust Creek on a Friday in 1882 had resolved into something that shaped the whole trajectory of their lives, his and Nellie's and the children's, and by extension, the children's children. The claim had grown into a genuine farm, respected in the community, productive and well-managed, built by the specific combination of Nellie's tenacity and Cornelius's capability, and the particular force of what happens when two people decide to build something together with full commitment. In 1901, they celebrated their 19th year of marriage in the way they had celebrated most significant occasions, which was quietly and with good food, and the people they loved gathered at the long table that had replaced the small kitchen table sometime in the 1890s to accommodate the increasing size of the family. Thomas and Hannah were there with their 3 children. Clara and Daniel had come up from town. Martha was back from a teachers' conference in Topeka. Franklin had ridden out from the county seat, where his law practice was beginning to establish itself. 9 people at the table plus Cornelius and Nellie at either end, and the house full of noise and opinion and overlapping conversation, and Cornelius looked down the length of the table at Nellie, who caught his eye and smiled, the full smile, the one that reached everything, and lifted her coffee cup slightly in his direction. He lifted his in return. The life they had was not without its difficulties. No honest life was. There were seasons of hardship and grief that visited in the way grief does. Abner Baxter died in 1897, and the loss of him was the loss of something that had been solid and good from the beginning of things. Reverend Hatch had passed in 1893, in his sleep, at the age of 74, and Cornelius had ridden to Caldwell for the funeral and stood at the graveside feeling the loss of a man who had inadvertently, by means of a fever and a poorly sealed envelope, changed the entire course of his life, and had always been glad of it. But the thread of good things was stronger than the difficulty, because they had built it strong, and because the foundation was what it was, honest and solid and chosen with full knowledge of what choosing meant. On a spring evening in 1902, 20 years from the Friday that Cornelius had ridden into Dust Creek on a roan horse named December, and stopped 40 yards from a woman standing on a porch with her hand raised to shade her eyes, Nellie found him on the front porch in the late afternoon light with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, and an expression she recognized as the expression of someone who is thinking about something they find significant. "What is it?" she asked, settling beside him. "I was thinking about December," he said. "The horse, that first day," she smiled. "He was a good horse." "He was. I was also thinking about your letter." "We seem to think about that letter frequently." "It deserves thinking about," he said. "It changed everything." She leaned her head against his shoulder in the way she had developed over years of evenings on this porch, comfortable and familiar and warm. "It did," she said. "Everything worth having started there." He put his arm around her, and they sat in the spring light with the windmill turning, and the crops green in the east field, and the sound of grandchildren, somewhere behind the house, engaged in a game whose rules only they fully understood, and the wide Kansas sky doing what it always did, which was to contain everything beneath it without effort or announcement. 20 years, she said quietly. 20 years, he agreed. Are you satisfied with how it went? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Nellie," he said, "I read a letter on a porch, and I rode 40 miles, and I fixed a fence post and ate coffee made by a woman who rationed it carefully and still offered it to a stranger, and I looked at a fraudulent document, and I met a boy who handed me boards off the ground and a little girl who offered me a rag doll for comfort. And out of all of that came 20 years of the best life I have had access to imagine, and children I love without reservation, and grandchildren who are still inventing their own games, and you most of all, always most of all." He felt her exhale against his shoulder. "I should have written 100 more letters," she said softly. "One was sufficient," he said. She laughed, and the laughter was the same as it had always been, warm and specific in his. And the spring wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and the windmill turned, and the grandchildren shouted something about the rules of their game that would need adjudicating shortly, and neither of them moved for a long while, because there was nowhere else either of them needed to be. The mule named Perseverance had long since retired and then passed, as mules eventually do. December was years gone. The small soddy with its wooden additions had become a proper farmhouse with a good porch and windows that fit their frames. The kitchen garden was the best-kept kitchen garden in the county, and Nellie's herb section had expanded every year until it was half the garden. The tin box of important papers had been joined by a second tin box, and the second by a small cedar chest, all of it evidence of a life with things worth recording. The letter that had started it all was still there, in the original envelope with the cream-colored paper gone the color of old bone. Nellie had kept it. She had kept it through every move and renovation and reorganization of the household, the way you keep the things that mark the beginning of your most important chapter even when you stop needing to read them, because the keeping itself is a form of gratitude. She never threw it away. It was there in the cedar chest when her children sorted through things in the years much later, still in its original envelope, addressed to Reverend Solomon Hatch, shepherd of the flock, Caldwell, Kansas. The gum long failed, the writing faded but legible. Next to a small piece of paper in a different hand, Cornelius's careful, direct handwriting that said, "Dear Mrs. Wainwright, my name is Cornelius Watkins." The children recognized it for what it was. Thomas held it for a long time, reading it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it back, and Martha said, 40 miles on a horse because of a letter he wasn't supposed to read. And Franklin said, "That's the law of unintended consequences working in everyone's favor for once." And Clara laughed in the warm way she had always laughed, the way she'd gotten from their mother. But that was later. And for now it was still a spring evening in 1902, and Cornelius Watkins was 51 years old, and in full health and sitting on a good porch. He had built himself beside the woman he had ridden 40 miles toward on a Friday morning, because something in a letter had reached through the paper and taken hold of something essential in him. And Nellie Wainwright Watkins was 50 years old, with silver in her bronze honey hair and her full regard for the man beside her intact and increasing. And the Kansas sky was doing its enormous, uncomplicated thing above the flat land. and the life they had built together in the years since a mule named Perseverance had carried the wrong man's mail was complete and good, and theirs entirely. It was, by any honest accounting, more than either of them had written to ask for. It was better.